The Hearth and Harvest family bakery stood at the edge of town like a relic from another era. Its brick facade, weathered by time, gleamed faintly under the glow of the nearby street lamp, and its bright red door felt like a warm invitation to anyone passing by. When I first saw the job listing for a night baker here, I thought I'd struck gold. It was a role that combined my love for food with the solitude I cherished. The pay was better than I'd ever hoped for, and the hours, while unconventional, fit my night owl tendencies perfectly. Little did I know that this job would be more than just a paycheck. The night I arrived for my first shift, the air was crisp with the scent of fresh pine and faintly sweet with the aroma of baked goods lingering from the day. I stood at the threshold, nervous yet eager, clutching a notepad where I'd scrawled recipe ideas to share someday. The bakery's owner, Mrs. Hargrove, had been kind enough during our interview, almost too kind, like she was relieved I'd accepted the job without much probing. "You're going to do just fine, Ollie," she said with a warm smile as she handed me the keys earlier that afternoon. "Just remember to follow the instructions I left for you." Instructions. It sounded odd, the way she'd emphasized it, but I chalked it up to her being a meticulous boss. After all, bakeries thrived on precision, didn't they? I figured the instructions were just recipes or cleaning checklists. But now, standing in the quiet kitchen with its polished counters and gleaming industrial ovens, I realized she'd meant something far more literal. The rules were taped to the inside of a cabinet door, written on aged parchment in neat, looping cursive. I had just started unpacking my bag of essentials when I noticed them. The rules. Rule number 1. The bread that rises on its own must be disposed of immediately. Rule number 2. Never open the oven if you hear knocking from inside. Rule number 3. If you hear laughter coming from the cold storage, lock the door and do not enter until sunrise. Rule number 4. Always bake the special loaf by 3 a.m., but do not eat it. Rule number 5. If a customer arrives after midnight, serve them politely and do not ask questions. Rule number 6. Leave a small piece of dough on the counter before you clock out. Rule number 7. Never look through the kitchen window after 2 a.m. At the bottom, a warning written in bold letters sent a chill down my spine. The bakery takes care of its own. Follow the rules, or you will become part of the dough. For a moment, I just stared at the list, a nervous laugh bubbling up in my throat. Surely, this was some sort of prank. A family bakery didn't need supernatural rules to operate, right? Still, there was something about the yellowed paper and the burnt edges that made the rules feel old, like they'd been here longer than the bakery itself. I shook it off, choosing to focus on the charm of the place instead. The warmth of the ovens, the neatly arranged shelves of ingredients, and the comforting hum of the industrial fridge all made it feel like a sanctuary. The first part of the night passed smoothly. I took inventory, prepped dough for the morning rush, and even tested out one of my own recipes, a cinnamon brioche I'd been dying to try. As the hours slipped by, the novelty of being alone in such a cozy space kept my mind from wandering too far into unease. But at midnight, things began to change. The bakery, which had felt warm and inviting, now seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer across the floor. I found myself glancing at the cabinet door more often than I wanted to admit, the rules etched into my mind even though I hadn't meant to memorize them. At 12:30 a.m., I noticed something strange. A batch of dough I'd left in the proofing tray earlier was rising unusually fast, too fast. I hadn't even added yeast yet. The soft mound of dough seemed to pulse slightly, as though it were alive. I swallowed hard, my fingers hovering over the edge of the tray. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind like a warning siren. The bread that rises on its own must be disposed of immediately. Grabbing the tray, I marched to the trash bin, my pulse quickening as I tilted the dough inside. For a second, it almost seemed to fight back, a ripple running through its surface before it collapsed into the bin with a wet thud. I shivered and quickly slammed the lid shut. By 1 a.m., I was trying to focus on kneading a fresh batch of dough when a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, almost rhythmic, but unmistakable. Knocking. I froze, my hands stilling over the dough. The sound was coming from the oven. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Rule number 2. Never open the oven if you hear knocking from inside. I couldn't move for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through logical explanations. Maybe it was the metal expanding? A bird caught in the vent? But the sound grew louder, sharper, as if something was demanding to be let out. My hands clenched into fists, and I backed away from the oven, my chest tight with fear. Eventually, the knocking stopped, leaving only the low hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the building settling. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of my imagination, but the unease lingered. As I continued my work, the shadows outside the kitchen window seemed to shift, though I refused to look directly at them. When my shift finally ended at dawn, I left the bakery feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The rules were more than just quirky guidelines, they were a lifeline. And something told me the bakery had far more secrets than I was ready to uncover. The next night began much the same way as the first, with the comforting routines of baking filling the early hours. I arrived just before midnight, the sharp chill of the Vermont winter biting at my cheeks as I unlocked the bakery door. Inside, the warmth of the ovens and the faint, lingering scent of cinnamon felt welcoming, though it wasn't enough to completely dispel the unease that had taken root after my first shift. I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking. The sound had been so deliberate, so purposeful, that I struggled to dismiss it as an innocent quirk of the bakery. The rules had taken on a new gravity, their burnt edges and cryptic warnings no longer feeling quaint or playful. I was starting to believe that they weren't just guidelines, they were rules for survival. Still, I reminded myself why I was here. The pay was excellent, and the hours suited me. Besides, I had always been good at following instructions. Rules were rules, and if these were the terms of the job, I could handle them. I got to work prepping the dough for the next morning's orders, enjoying the methodical rhythm of measuring, mixing, and kneading. The radio I'd brought played softly in the background, filling the empty space with familiar tunes that made me feel less alone. For a while, it was easy to forget about the strange occurrences of the previous night. Around 12:30 a.m., I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart leapt, but when I turned, I saw nothing unusual, just the proofing trays lined up neatly on the counter. I shook my head, telling myself I was just jumpy, but my body remained tense. Then, as I checked the oven to ensure it was preheated for the next batch, I heard it again. Faint but distinct, like a child's giggle echoing down a long hallway. The sound came from the cold storage. My breath caught in my throat. Rule number 3 flashed in my mind. If you hear laughter coming from the cold storage, lock the door and do not enter until sunrise. The laughter continued, light and airy, yet somehow wrong, as though it were coming from something trying to mimic human joy. My hands trembled as I walked to the cold storage door. The bakery felt colder than usual, the warmth of the ovens failing to reach me as I grabbed the heavy latch and pulled it shut with a loud clank. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers stiff and clumsy, but managed to secure it. The laughter stopped immediately, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. I returned to my work, though my movements felt mechanical, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was in the cold storage? And why did the rules feel so specific, as though they had been crafted to counter something malicious? By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, I was both exhausted and on edge. I prepared the special loaf as the rules instructed, carefully measuring the ingredients from a recipe card tucked into a small wooden box labeled private. The dough felt different from the others, heavier, almost alive, as if it were resisting my touch. When I placed the loaf in the oven, the air in the bakery seemed to shift. The warmth turned stifling, and the shadows near the kitchen window stretched unnaturally long. I avoided looking directly at the glass, keeping my focus on the oven timer. The loaf baked perfectly, its golden crust almost too flawless. As I removed it from the oven and set it on the cooling rack, I felt an odd sense of relief, as if completing this task had appeased something unseen. Just as I was cleaning up, I heard the back door creak open. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The rules didn't mention anything about the back door, only customers arriving after midnight. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, half expecting to see nothing but the cold night air beyond the threshold. Instead, there stood a man, his features obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and the dim light from the kitchen. His presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong here, but he wasn't overtly threatening. "Good evening," he said in a flat, monotone voice. I remembered rule number 5, if a customer arrives after midnight, serve them politely and do not ask questions. "Good evening," I replied, forcing a smile. "What can I get for you?" The man didn't move from the doorway. "1 loaf of rye bread," he said after a long pause, his voice carrying an odd echo. I grabbed a loaf from the display rack, wrapping it in parchment paper and handing it to him. His gloved hand brushed mine as he took it, and I suppressed a shiver at the unnatural chill of his touch. "Thank you," he said, stepping back into the shadows. He disappeared before I could close the door, leaving no footprints in the thin layer of snow outside. I locked the door and leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced with questions, but I knew better than to dwell on them. The rules had kept me safe so far, and I wasn't about to test their limits. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When dawn finally arrived, I left a piece of dough on the counter as instructed, locked the bakery, and stepped into the cool morning air. As I walked home, I couldn't help but feel like the bakery was more alive than I had realized. It wasn't just a building, it was something ancient, something sentient. And I was beginning to understand why Mrs. Hargrove had been so insistent about following the rules. The next evening, I approached the bakery with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The faint glow from the kitchen window illuminated the snow-covered ground, making the otherwise inviting building appear like a lantern in the encroaching darkness. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind, the laughter from the cold storage, the strange man at the back door, and the inexplicable rules that seemed to govern the bakery's every shadowed corner. But the paycheck was real, and so was my resolve to see this through. I arrived early and decided to explore more of the bakery before my shift officially began. Something about this place was deeply unsettling, but it also drew me in, as if whispering promises of answers if I looked hard enough. The kitchen was already stocked with ingredients, and the ovens hummed faintly, their warmth creating an odd sense of comfort. In the corner of the kitchen, near the old wooden shelves, I noticed a small door I hadn't seen before. It was partially hidden by a stack of flour bags, its surface scratched and weathered. I crouched down to inspect it, running my fingers along the peeling paint. The door wasn't locked, but something in the back of my mind told me not to open it. The rules didn't mention this door. Reluctantly, I stood and turned away, convincing myself to focus on the tasks ahead. As I began prepping the dough for the night's orders, my thoughts wandered to the bakery's history. It seemed impossible that such an ordinary-looking place could harbor so much strangeness. Determined to find out more, I made a mental note to do some digging. Perhaps there were answers in town, people who knew the bakery's past or had heard stories about its peculiarities. For now, though, I had rules to follow and bread to bake. The first hours of my shift passed uneventfully. I kneaded dough, measured ingredients, and kept the ovens running. The familiar rhythm of baking helped settle my nerves, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I glanced at the window, careful not to look too closely, as the rules warned. The shadows outside seemed to dance and shift, but I refused to let my imagination get the better of me. Around midnight, I decided to explore the storage room more thoroughly. I'd noticed an old ledger tucked away on a dusty shelf during my first shift, but I hadn't had the chance to examine it. Now, with the kitchen momentarily quiet, I retrieved the leather-bound book and flipped it open. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, listing dates, ingredients, and orders. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple inventory log, but as I read further, strange entries began to stand out. July 12, 1923. Special loaf prepared. Offered successfully. Shadow receded. September 30th, 1924. Laughter in cold storage again. Door secured. No incident. November 15th, 1926. Bread rising without yeast increasing in frequency. Disposed of 2 batches tonight. Must remain vigilant. My stomach twisted as I realized these entries matched the rules I'd been following. This ledger wasn't just an inventory, It was a record of events, a testament to the rule's importance. One entry, written in bold letters and underlined, sent a chill down my spine. Never break the rules. The bakery protects, but only if you obey. I snapped the book shut, my heart pounding. It wasn't just me. Others had been here before, dealing with the same inexplicable phenomena. But where were they now? Had they simply quit, like I planned to do eventually? Or had they? I shook the thought away and returned to the kitchen, the ledger clutched tightly in my hands. Setting it on the counter, I resolved to finish my shift without any further distractions. But the bakery had other plans. As I prepared a batch of sourdough, I heard it, faint laughter echoing from the cold storage. My body froze, and my pulse quickened. I knew what to do. Rule number 3 was clear, but the sound was louder this time, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I approached the cold storage door and locked it without hesitation. The laughter stopped immediately, as if cut off by an unseen hand. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the door, half expecting something to burst through. But the silence held, and I forced myself to return to my work. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tension and unease. The bread that rose on its own was easier to deal with now. I simply threw it away without hesitation. The special loaf, however, continued to unsettle me. As I kneaded the dough for it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, its surface pulsing faintly under my hands. At 3 a.m., I placed the special loaf in the oven, its golden crust forming almost immediately. The smell it emitted was intoxicating, sweet and savory at once, yet it filled me with an inexplicable dread. When it was done, I set it on the cooling rack and refused to look at it again. As I cleaned up for the night, I thought about the man who had appeared at the back door the previous night. His pale skin, the chill of his touch, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The ledger hinted at offerings and patrons, but it didn't explain who, or what, they were. Finally, dawn arrived. I left a piece of dough on the counter as the rules instructed, locked the bakery, and stepped into the cold morning air. My breath formed clouds as I walked home, my thoughts racing with questions. What was the special loaf for? Who were the rules protecting? And most importantly, how long could I keep doing this before the bakery demanded something more? When I returned for my third shift at Hearth and Harvest, a heavy unease had settled in my chest. Each step toward the bakery felt like a step deeper into some hidden labyrinth, the kind you couldn't find your way out of once you ventured too far. The small red door stood out against the surrounding dark, glowing like a malevolent invitation. The rules had taken on a gravity I couldn't ignore. They weren't quirks or superstitions, they were survival guides, meant to protect me from things I barely understood. With the ledger still fresh in my mind, I resolved to do everything by the book. The first half hour passed uneventfully. I prepped dough, measured ingredients, and kept a wary eye on the kitchen window. Though I didn't see anything unusual, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me from the shadows beyond the glass. Just after midnight, the back door buzzer sounded. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to remain calm. Rule number 5 was clear: serve the customer and ask no questions. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. A woman stood outside, her face partially obscured by the hood of a dark coat. Her presence felt off, something about the way she stood too still, her head tilted slightly to the side. Swallowing my nerves, I opened the door. "Good evening," I said, forcing a smile. "What can I get for you?" The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she raised her hand, which was gloved, and pointed toward the display case in the kitchen. I followed her gesture, noting that she didn't step inside. Her feet remained firmly planted just outside the threshold. "A loaf," she finally said, her voice soft but oddly hollow. I hurried to retrieve one of the freshly baked loaves from the counter. "Here you go," I said, holding it out to her. She took it without a word, her gloved fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. A sharp, cold sensation shot up my arm, making me recoil slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice lingering in the air like an echo. Then she turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me standing there with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I shut the door and bolted it, my hands trembling slightly. Rule number 5 had been followed, but the encounter left me shaken. Who were these people? Why did they come to the bakery after midnight, and what did they need the bread for? Pushing the questions aside, I returned to my work. I didn't want to dwell on things I couldn't understand, not while I still had hours left in my shift. At 2 a.m., the shadows outside the kitchen window began to shift again. This time, they moved with a purpose, like figures pacing back and forth just beyond the glass. I focused on the dough in front of me, refusing to look directly at the window. The tapping started a few minutes later, gentle at first, then growing more insistent. A part of me wanted to peek, just for a second, to confirm that it was nothing more than a stray branch or an animal. But the memory of the elongated shadow I'd glimpsed before stopped me. Instead, I concentrated on kneading the dough, my knuckles pressing into its pliable surface as if I could work out my fear through the motion. The tapping continued for another minute before fading into silence. When I finally glanced up, the shadows were gone, and the window was just a pane of glass again. I sighed, relieved, but the reprieve didn't last long. A faint knocking came from the oven. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, each knock echoing through the quiet kitchen. My hands froze mid-motion, dough sticking to my fingers as I stared at the oven door. The rules were explicit: do not open the oven if you hear knocking. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, like someone, or something, was trapped inside and wanted out. Every instinct screamed at me to open the door, to see what was causing the noise. But I knew better. Instead, I turned my back on the oven and began cleaning the counter, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The sound didn't stop, but I refused to give it any attention. Gradually, it diminished, fading until the kitchen was silent once more. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, my nerves were frayed. I prepared the special loaf with a sense of dread, the dough feeling unusually warm under my hands. As I placed it in the oven, the air in the kitchen seemed to shift, growing heavier, almost oppressive. When the loaf was finished, I set it on the cooling rack and stepped away quickly. The smell was intoxicating, just like before, but this time it seemed to linger in my nostrils, making my head spin. I avoided looking directly at it, instead focusing on tidying up for the end of my shift. Before clocking out, I left a small piece of dough on the counter as instructed. The act had become almost ritualistic, a gesture of appeasement to whatever forces governed the bakery. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the early morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The bakery felt more alive, more aware of my presence. And though I'd followed every rule to the letter, I couldn't escape the sense that the bakery was testing me, waiting for me to slip up. Returning to Hearth and Harvest for my next shift felt like stepping into a trap that I was only just beginning to comprehend. The air outside was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. The small red door of the bakery loomed ahead, its cheerful hue now unsettling in the moonlight. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately hit by the familiar scent of flour, sugar, and butter. But underneath it all was something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of old coins. I shook off the unease and focused on the tasks ahead. The rules were ingrained in my mind now, and I knew better than to question them. I went about the familiar routine of preparing dough, preheating the ovens, and organizing the ingredients for the night. Everything seemed normal at first, but that sense of being watched crept back, stronger than ever. It wasn't long before the first disturbance of the night arrived. While I was rolling out a batch of croissants, the cold storage door creaked open slightly, just enough to create a sliver of darkness in the otherwise bright kitchen. My stomach dropped. Rule number 3 echoed in my mind: if you hear laughter coming from the cold storage, lock the door and do not enter until sunrise. I froze, rolling pin in hand, waiting for the faintest sound of laughter. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the silence in the bakery becoming oppressive. Just as I began to convince myself it was a trick of the wind, I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, like a child trying to suppress laughter. The sound sent chills down my spine. It wasn't playful or innocent, it was sharp and mocking, as though it knew exactly how much it unnerved me. I grabbed the key from the counter and approached the cold storage door, my hand trembling as I pushed it closed and locked it. The laughter continued for a few moments before fading, replaced by the low hum of the freezer motor. I stood there, staring at the locked door, my mind racing with questions I couldn't afford to ask. I backed away slowly and returned to my station, doing my best to act like nothing had happened. As the hours passed, the disturbances became more frequent. A shadow moved past the kitchen window, just at the edge of my vision. When I glanced up, there was nothing there, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I kept my eyes down and focused on my work, resisting the urge to look again. At 2 a.m., I heard a soft knock at the back door. My heart raced as I approached it, remembering rule number 5. Through the peephole, I saw another visitor, a man this time, wearing a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes were so dark they looked like hollow pits. He stood perfectly still, holding a small satchel in one hand. I opened the door cautiously, my voice steady despite my fear. "Good evening. How can I help you?" The man didn't respond right away. He handed me the satchel without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. I hesitated before taking it, the fabric feeling unnaturally warm in my hands. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as though he'd never been there at all. I brought the satchel inside, placing it on the counter without opening it. Whatever was inside wasn't my concern. I knew better than to ask questions or investigate further. Still, the encounter left me rattled, and I found it hard to concentrate as I continued my shift. At 3 a.m., it was time to bake the special loaf. I prepared the dough with the same care as before, though this time the process felt different. The dough seemed heavier, denser, and it pulsed faintly under my hands. I tried to ignore it, shaping it into the familiar form and placing it in the oven. As the loaf baked, the air in the kitchen grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and rich, but it carried an undercurrent of something darker. I forced myself to focus on cleaning the counters and organizing the shelves, refusing to look at the oven until the timer went off. When I finally removed the loaf, it was perfect, almost too perfect. The crust was a deep golden brown, the shape flawless. But as I set it on the cooling rack, I noticed something strange. The surface of the bread seemed to shift slightly, like it was breathing. I stepped back, my pulse quickening, and turned away. I didn't need to see more. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of unease. The shadows outside the window returned, moving in patterns that felt deliberate, almost choreographed. The cold storage door rattled briefly, though the lock held firm. I followed every rule to the letter, resisting the urge to let my curiosity get the better of me. Before clocking out, I left a piece of dough on the counter as instructed. The act felt less like a tradition and more like an offering, a way to appease whatever forces governed this place. As I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, the night felt quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Walking home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The streets were empty, the only sound the soft crunch of my footsteps on the pavement. But every so often, I thought I heard another set of footsteps, faint and distant, keeping pace with me. I didn't look back. Returning to the bakery for my next shift felt like willingly stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The pleasant aroma of bread and pastries greeted me as usual, but now it felt like a mask covering something far more sinister. I locked the door behind me and took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever the night might bring. By this point, the rules were second nature, and I knew deviating from them wasn't an option. Still, the oppressive atmosphere was becoming harder to ignore. As I began prepping for the night, every small noise set my nerves on edge. The whir of the refrigerator, the hiss of the ovens, even the hum of the fluorescent lights, they all seemed louder, almost alive. My hands moved automatically as I kneaded dough, but my mind was elsewhere, hyper-focused on the sounds around me. At 1:30 a.m., I noticed something unusual. The special loaf's dough, which I hadn't yet prepared, seemed to be forming on its own in the large mixing bowl. The ingredients weren't where I had left them, but there was the dough, perfectly mixed and beginning to rise. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it. Rule number 1 echoed in my head: the bread that rises on its own must be disposed of immediately. I grabbed the mixing bowl, careful not to let my skin touch the dough, and carried it to the trash. As I dumped the dough into the bin, I thought I saw it twitch, like it was trying to cling to the bowl. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to look away and returned to my station. The night continued with small, disquieting incidents. Shadows outside the window shifted more frequently, and I caught faint glimpses of figures in the corner of my eye. Each time I turned to look, they were gone. The air grew heavier, and I found myself glancing at the cold storage door, half expecting it to creak open again. At 2 a.m., the oven began to rattle, the sound reverberating through the kitchen. I froze, knowing exactly what was coming. The knocking started softly at first, a gentle tap tap tap, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. Rule number 2 was clear: never open the oven if you hear knocking from inside. I gripped the counter tightly, resisting the urge to investigate. The knocking continued, now accompanied by faint whispers. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted silently, willing it to stop. Finally, the noise ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost worse. I checked the clock. 2:34 a.m. The special loaf needed to be prepared soon, but the kitchen felt heavier than before, as though the air itself was pressing down on me. I retrieved the ingredients and began mixing the dough, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As I worked, the dough felt warm, almost alive under my hands, and the faint whispers returned, though this time they seemed to be coming from the dough itself. I placed the loaf in the oven just as the clock struck 3 a.m. As it baked, the room grew unnaturally quiet, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. My heart raced as I waited for the timer to go off, counting down the seconds with a sense of dread. When I finally pulled the loaf out, it was perfect, too perfect, just like before. The crust shimmered faintly in the dim light, and the air around it felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I left the loaf on the counter to cool, careful not to touch it directly. The rules were clear: the loaf was not for me. I busied myself with cleaning, trying to keep my mind off the unsettling presence of the bread. At 3:30 a.m., the shadows outside the window began tapping on the glass. Their movements were deliberate, almost playful, as if they were testing me. Rule number 7 was clear: never look through the kitchen window after 2 a.m. I kept my gaze firmly on the counter, but the tapping grew louder, more frantic, as though the shadows were angry at being ignored. The laughter from the cold storage returned, echoing faintly through the kitchen. I didn't hesitate this time, locking the door quickly and stepping away. The sound persisted for what felt like hours, growing louder and more distorted before abruptly stopping. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. As dawn approached, I completed my final tasks, leaving a small piece of dough on the counter as instructed. The act felt ritualistic, a gesture of appeasement to whatever forces governed this place. I locked the bakery door behind me and stepped into the early morning light, the weight on my chest lifting slightly as I walked away. At home, I tried to shake off the unease, but the bakery's presence lingered in my mind. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard the faint sound of bread rising, a soft, rhythmic puffing that sent chills down my spine.